Well, welcome to the Lord's Seminary, and this is lecture number 14 in our church history course, Early Church History, from the time of the Apostles until around the year 500. And this is our 14th lecture, as I said. The topic today is the spread of Christianity to areas other than the Roman Empire in the period of time this particular course covers. So let's go ahead and share our screen, and let's see, where are we? Here we go. So as we look at our material today, let's go ahead and go to the slideshow from the beginning. Okay. So up to this point in this course, we have focused mainly on the spread and development of Christianity within the Roman Empire, because that's where it began, of course. And we've considered how the gospel has moved from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to Antioch to Asia Minor to Greece and Rome, and how the church grew under both persecution and imperial favor. So we're seeing the gospel on the continents of Asia, where it's begun in the Middle East, and then in Africa and into Europe itself. But Christianity was never confined to the Roman Empire itself. Uh, Even in the earliest days, the gospel crosses borders and travels along trade routes, caravan trails, cultural exchanges that Rome could not control. Merchants carried the gospel with them. Missionaries sought out new fields. Refugees fleeing persecution spread the faith to new lands. So, in this lecture, we're going to look at the spread of Christianity between the uh, uh, time of AD 70, thereabouts, till about the year 500, to areas primarily outside of the Roman Empire: Persia, Armenia, Georgia, Ethiopia, Arabia, India, even towards Central Asia and to China itself. And by the end of this lecture, we're going to see that Christianity was a global faith from the beginning, speaking many languages and adapting to many cultures. Now, before we get into the spread outside the empire, we do need to kind of discuss a little bit of its reaching the farthest points of the Roman Empire itself. We want to see it spread in Hispania, which is today modern day Spain and Portugal, into Gaul, which would be France, and into Britain. The gospel was making great advances into the western provinces of the Roman Empire. So, talking about Hispania, which is today Spain and Gaul, or I mean Spain and Portugal, uh, the gospel reached there. Remember the Apostle Paul was wanting to make a journey to Spain and to take the gospel to those areas as well. It spreads probably through merchants and soldiers throughout the peninsula itself. We see churches are organized throughout the peninsula. Also, there are those who have been martyred for their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ during this time. So we see this spread into these various provinces as well, and Spain becomes very, very, very Roman Catholic. Now, later on, you're going to see the Muslim invasion of the Spanish or the Hispanic peninsula, and then they're being driven out from Spain and Portugal later on, and that's for later courses here in church history. By the third century, there were organized churches throughout. You have martyrs like Justa and Rufina of Seville. Um, Hispania was thoroughly Christianized by about the fourth century, producing both saints and controversy, such as Priscillian of Avila, who was an ascetic whose movement was condemned as being heretical. And even when the Visigoths, these barbarian invaders, reach into the Iberian Peninsula in the 5th century, Christianity remained firmly established there. In Gaul, to the north, there is the several provinces there. It's now what we would call modern France and Belgium, parts of the Netherlands, and so forth. You have communities by the late second century in Lyon and Vienne. Um, we've talked about Irenaeus of Lyon, who is one of the most important early theologians. He ministered there. He defended orthodoxy against Gnosticism. In the fourth century, you have figures like Martin of Tours, who becomes famous for his missionary work and pastoral care. And then Gaul quickly becomes a center of monastic life, shaping Christian spirituality for centuries to come, amongst the communal forms of monasticism as opposed to the desert fathers and so forth that we've discussed before, and the hermetic um, monastic communities as opposed to Cenobitic, the community-oriented monastic life. And then Britain, or Britannia as it was known, Roman Britain, the gospel has reached there by the third century, carried by soldiers and merchants, possibly missionaries who are sent up to the Roman province of Britain. You see the various divisions there. You see a road network, and you have various walls built. Hadrian's Wall is one that's known, and there's one of Antonine even farther north to keep out the invaders from Scotland. My Scottish ancestors were causing a lot of trouble for the Roman Britons. You have the martyrdom of Saint Alban, who was Britain's first recorded Christian martyr, showing the faith is firmly present before Constantine in 325. So by the early part of the 5th century, so the early part of the 400s, Britain had bishops and churches. Though after Rome's withdrawal and the invasions of the Anglo-Saxons, Christianity was largely pushed to the western fringes into Wales and Cornwall in the far southwest and up into Scotland, and later re-evangelization would be needed. So those are some of the the western provinces of the Roman Empire that we wanted to quickly take a look at. But let's move on to the main topic here for this lecture itself. These western expansions into the western part of the empire, they've already been following patterns that we have seen in Rome and the Mediterranean area. But today we want to focus, kind of move eastward and southward, talking about the spread of Christianity outside of the normal recognized Roman Empire's borders and influence, places like Persia, Armenia, Ethiopia, Arabia, India, Central Asia itself. So let's talk about Christianity in the East. Now, here are some of the regions that we're going to explore. We have various trade routes by sea, denoted by the blue lines itself, and the red lines, overland routes as well, where there's a lot of trade and cultural interchange back and forth. And sometimes you'll see, especially along the land routes, various invaders coming along those routes. We'll have more on that in another course. But you can see that just as the Roman road system in the empire helped in the spread of the gospel, one of those major means by which the Lord had used to help further the spread of the gospel. We also see these routes by sea and overland as well. The Lord leveraged those areas as well. So where people go, the gospel goes. And these places are independent of the Roman Empire and often at times hostile. There were lots of fights back and forth between the Persians or empires out of Persia and the eastern portions of the Roman Empire itself. Uh, the gospel takes deep root in a number of these areas and in some ways develops its own distinct identity as opposed to what you see in the empire itself, but also especially in the western part of the empire. Let's talk about the first Christian city by the name of Edessa. Here's a reminder to us of the Roman Empire, the western part of the empire, the eastern part of the empire. And we see the western side falling around 481. And under barbarian influence, the Eastern Empire continues on until 1453. All right, let's talk about Edessa. It's in southeastern Turkey. It became known in tradition as a first Christian city. There's a famous legend that King Abgar of Edessa, who is said to have written to Jesus asking him to come and to heal him. And Jesus, according to the story, replied, he's going to send one of his disciples later to bring the gospel there. Well, whether this is true or not, and in fact, it's probably more rightly treated as being legend. The story itself shows how strongly Edessa was associated with early Christianity. And what is historically clear that by the late second and early third centuries, Edessa had become a center of the faith. Christianity in Edessa flourished in Syriac. That's a dialect of Aramaic. It is significant. The West emphasizes Greek and Latin. Here, the church is growing in the language of the people of the East. Let's talk a little bit about early Syriac Christianity. It produces its own literature and theology. You have figures like Bardesan of Edessa, who died in the year 222, shows us the intellectual vigor of the community. He was a philosopher and a Christian thinker who engaged questions of fate and free will and divine providence. Some of his views were debated, but he illustrates that Christianity is being reflected upon outside the Greek-speaking world. The use of Syriac also paved the way for early Bible translations. The Syriac version of the scriptures, called the Peshitta, became central to Christian life in the East, just as the Latin Vulgate version would be later on in the West. And then let's go further east to Persia. Christianity spreads from Edessa and other centers. It goes further east into the Parthian and then the Sasanian empires and regions now that we would call Iran, Iraq and Iran. And this was often a precarious existence. The Persians were wary of Christians because of their connection, whether real or imagined, to the Roman Empire. Remember, these empires have been at loggerheads with each other. And so Christians and having allegiance back to the Eastern Empire or to the Western Empire, that is definitely something that would make them wary of Christians. When Constantine made Christianity legal in Rome, and then later emperors favored it, and then it becomes an official religion, it just amps up the suspicion on the part of the Persian authorities with regards to their own Christian subjects. Were they political allies with the Romans? And as a result, the Persian church often suffered persecution, especially in the 4th century under Shapur II, who lived from 309 to 379, when many Christians were martyred in Persia. Uh, the church in the East grows, though, despite, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. We've read earlier. Uh, the Christians organize themselves in Persia, and you have an independent church body at that time. They're not answerable to the church authorities in the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, and certainly not to the Bishop of Rome. Over time, it becomes known as the Church of the East, distinguished in its use of Syriac and its distance from Roman authorities. And that church would become a powerful missionary sending body in the centuries to come. They send the gospel along the Silk Road and eventually all the way to India and China. So these stories early on of the churches in Edessa and Persia show us that Christianity was never simply just a Roman religion itself. From the very beginning, it was a faith that crossed borders, that adapted to new languages, that took root in new cultural settings. And the Eastern Church reminds us that the Christian story is larger than the boundaries of empire. It is global, it's multilingual, and resilient even under persecution. Let's talk about the spread of the gospel. We've talked about it spread to the east. Let's talk about it spread to the northeast, and the spread of Christianity into Armenia and Georgia. The gospel moves northwest into the Caucasus regions, into kingdoms of Armenia and Georgia. It was known as Iberia, and keep it separate from the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. This is a region around Georgia. It was known as Iberia. These two lands would become some of the earliest Christian nations in the world. They adopted the faith not only at the popular level, but as a matter of royal and national identity. Armenia holds the distinction of being the first officially Christian state in the world. According to tradition, this came about through the ministry of Gregory the Illuminator. He was imprisoned for many years by King Tiridates III, but after his release, he preached the gospel to the king and people. The king was converted around the year 301, leading Armenia to adopt Christianity as the religion of the kingdom. So you see the Edict of Milan in 313, so this is some 12 years earlier. And so Armenia is very proud of the fact that it's the first Christian state in the world. Uh, let's talk a little bit about the development of Armenian Christianity itself. It quickly developed its own identity, but it was deeply influenced by the neighboring church of Caesarea in Cappadocia and by the Syriac-speaking Christians who were further east. So it has this influence coming from the southeast and from the east. One of the most significant developments came in the early 5th century with Mesrop Mashtots, who invents the Armenian alphabet around the year 405. That allows the scriptures to be translated into Armenian. People, literacy in the kingdom itself advances because it's now been reduced. You have an alphabet. People can not be dependent upon Syriac translations or other translations. The scriptures can now be translated into Armenian. And it also meant that Christian writings, hymns, theology could flourish in the vernacular language, the language of the Armenians. And so the invention of the Armenian alphabet shows how closely literacy, culture, and Christianity are linked, just as Greek and Latin had served as vehicles of theology in the Roman world. So Armenian now becomes a carrier of the gospel for a whole people. Let's move on to Georgia, or as we mentioned, it was known as Iberia. Uh, Slightly later than what had occurred in Armenia, but no less significant, you see the conversion of Georgia. Not to be confused with the state in the United States, Georgia, which is immediately to the west of where I live. Um, this is the country of Georgia, and we have the country of Georgia today. We also have the country of Armenia today. The missionary here was not a man, but a woman, Nino of Cappadocia, who's often remembered as Saint Nino. Tradition is she carried a cross made of grapevines bound with her own hair. And through her witness, the queen of Iberia or Georgia was converted first, and then the king around the 330s. And with the royal family's conversion, Christianity becomes the official religion of the kingdom. And then we see the Iberian church, the Georgian church, begin to flourish. So, looking at the examples of both Armenia and Georgia, we see how Christianity could spread not only through grassroots evangelism, but also through the conversion of rulers and the adoption of Christianity as the religion of the realm. Now, when you have a top-down conversion like that, it becomes officially Christian, but are the people still pagan? Are they in their attitudes? And that takes a while for that to change. These churches also highlight how quickly Christianity adapted to local languages and customs, taking root in the unique cultures of the Caucasus. These kingdoms become an important buffer states between the Roman Empire to the west and Persia to the east, and their Christian identity often put them in the middle of political and military struggles. The conversion of Armenia and Georgia reminds us that Christianity was not only a faith of individuals, but also could shape entire nations. By the early 5th century, these churches have their own scriptures in their languages, liturgies, traditions, deeply embedding the gospel in the identity of their peoples. In later centuries, both Armenia and Georgia would suffer greatly from invasion and oppression, and yet their Christian identity proves remarkably durable, rooted in these early centuries. Let's move on to Christianity now to the south, to Ethiopia, the Aksumite kingdom. It was in what is today Ethiopia and Eritrea. Ethiopia's Christian story is one of the most remarkable in church history. It's deeply ancient, it's rooted in Scripture itself, and enduring down to our present day. Now, there had been connections between Ethiopia, or Sheba as it's known in some circles, and the time of Solomon. You remember the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon in the Old Testament. And for centuries, there had been interchange between the Hebrews and the Ethiopians, and a number of the Hebrews had converted to Judaism. And so you have the occasion then of the eunuch, the court official of Candace, who is queen of the Ethiopians, who's gone to Jerusalem to worship, and then is in his chariot when Philip meets him. He's been reading from the scroll of Isaiah and the sections in Isaiah 53 concerning the suffering of our Savior. And Philip asks him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" He says, how can I? Is he talking about himself, or is he talking about somebody else?" And that was the door opener for Philip to share the gospel with him. We see all this recorded in Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. The eunuch believes and is baptized, and we cannot trace a direct line between this eunuch and later Ethiopian Christianity. It does show us that the gospel was reaching Africa from the very earliest days. Now, it's in northern Africa, in the northern part of the empire, but it makes inroads farther south itself. And so Ethiopia was in the Christian imagination from the beginning. The Aksumite kingdom, by the 4th century, has become a powerful trading empire. They controlled key routes between the Red Sea and the interior of Africa. Aksum traded with Rome and Arabia and India. This made it fertile ground for the movement of ideas as well as goods. Into this setting comes the key figures of Ethiopia's Christian foundation. A couple of people called Frumentus and Edessius. According to the church historian Rufinus, two young men from Tyre in what is now Lebanon, Frumentus and Edessius were traveling by sea when their ship was attacked off the coast of the Red Sea. They were taken as slaves to the court of Aksum, but eventually they gained favor with the king. And when the king died, Frumentius served as tutor to the young heir, Idzana, and used his position to encourage the growth of Christianity in the kingdom. And later, Frumentius traveled up to Alexandria in northern Egypt. He was consecrated bishop by Athanasius, the great defender of Nicene Orthodoxy. And so Frumentius returns to Ethiopia and becomes the first bishop of Aksum. So interesting how in the providence of God, the Lord moving all things according to the counsel of his will, these men were traveling, their ship had been attacked, they had been taken as slaves, and we think, oh, how horrible, what a tragedy, and so forth. But this was how the Lord was moving things for his glory, to bring the Ethiopians to himself. Now, under Frumentius's influence, King Ezana himself is converted in the early 4th century. And inscriptions from Ezana's reign show a shift from pagan references to the Lord of Heaven. And with the conversion of the king, Ethiopia becomes a Christian kingdom alongside of Armenia and Georgia. Ethiopian Christianity has some unique aspects to it. It has strong ties to the Coptic Church of Alexandria, the Egyptian church, but it quickly develops its own distinctive identity. The scriptures are translated into Ge'ez, which is the ancient Ethiopian language, making the Bible accessible to the people. Ethiopian Christians developed a rich liturgical and monastic tradition marked by fasting and prayer and unique worship practices. And their church architecture and art, such as these rock-hewn churches. See, this is a church that's carved down into a solid stone rock outcropping and is carved out of that. So you're looking from the surface down into where they hollowed out and also hollowed in to make this structure for that church. These rock-hewn churches, illustrated manuscripts, they reflect a deeply local expression of the Christian faith. Now, unlike many of the ancient churches that later disappeared under Islamic expansion, the Ethiopian church endures. Its remote location, a strong national identity, and deeply rooted Christian culture enables it to remain a Christian nation through centuries of isolation. Even today, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church remains one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. So again, as we see the gospel moving south into Ethiopia, it shows us the global scope of the gospel from Jerusalem to Africa, from Philip and the eunuch to Frumentius and King Edzana. It also reminds us that Christianity did not flow only from centers of Roman power outward. In Ethiopia, the faith came through unexpected channels, slaves who become missionaries, a king who becomes a Christian ruler, and people who make the gospel their own. So Ethiopia stands as one of the most enduring witnesses to Christianity's diversity and resilience outside the Roman Empire. Well, the gospel not only moved northeast into Armenia and Georgia and south into Ethiopia, but it also spread southeast into the Arabian Peninsula and further still into India. And both these regions show how trade routes and cultural exchange play a major role in the expansion of the faith. Now, let's talk about the move of Christianity into Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula in late antiquity was not an isolated desert, but a land of tribes, of caravans, of trade routes connecting the Ethiopian world, uh, the connecting the Mediterranean world with Persia and Africa and India. By the third and fourth centuries, there are Christian communities established in various parts of Arabia. In the northern part, we see the rise of Christian Arab tribes such as the Ghassanids, who are aligned with the Byzantine Empire. They often adopted Christianity in its Chalcedonian form. Their rivals, the Lakhmids, allied with Persia. They also had Christian elements, often leading toward the Nestorian or Eastern Syriac traditions. You have Christian influence in the area also coming through monasticism. Desert hermits and monks established monasteries in Arabia, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula and along caravan routes. These ascetics were respected figures whose piety often drew seekers from Jewish and pagan backgrounds. Though Arabia would later become the birthplace of Islam in the 7th century, by the 4th and 5th century, it was already home to a number of diverse Christian communities connected to Byzantium in the north and Ethiopia to the west. Now, some of these Christian communities we're going to put air quotes around because some of them are heretical, embracing various views of Christ as not being accurate. And so what happens is later on when Muhammad is interacting with these peoples, his impression of Christianity is skewed. And therefore, what he relates in the Quran is not the accurate view of Christianity. And it's this inaccurate, skewed view of what Christians believe is what has been handed down in Islam through the centuries. I teach a group of pastors and evangelists on a monthly basis in Pakistan, and it's just amazing the misimpressions and the misunderstandings of what Christianity believes that are abroad amongst the Muslims around them, and it just gets repeated over and over because they believe that the Quran is inspired by God, and therefore it's without error, and so what it's teaching about Christianity is the true truth. And it's just staggering what they believe, what we believe, and it's because of this influence of some of these heretics in the areas there in Arabia that Muhammad encountered. Let's talk about Christianity in South India. The spread of the gospel to the Indian subcontinent it's just amazing, especially in the southwestern coast known as Malabar. Indian Christians are often called St. Thomas Christians or St. Thoma because, or Mar Thoma Christians, Mar being a saint, because tradition holds that the Apostle Thomas himself traveled there in the first century. And according to that tradition, Thomas arrived on the Malabar coast. He preaches the gospel, he performs miracles, and eventually suffered martyrdom in Mylapore near modern day Chennai. Historians debate the details, but the very persistence of this tradition points to an ancient and deep rooted Christian presence in India. Now, we can confirm historically that by the third and fourth centuries, there are well established Christian communities in South India. And these communities were connected to the wider Christian world through trade. Roman merchants, Syriac traders, Persian Christians all sailed the Indian Ocean, bringing not only goods, but also the gospel. And the Syriac-speaking Church of the East played a particularly important role, sending bishops and clergy to minister to Indian Christians. These Indian Christians maintain their own distinct identity. They blend local customs with Syriac liturgy. They practice the faith in ways that are shaped by both their cultural context and their connection to the Persian and Syriac churches. And these churches persist today. A number of years ago, when I was pastoring another church in another state, we had a young man marry a young lady whose family background is from these Mar Thoma churches in South India. She, had grown up in this faith, and very Indian family, but she marries a Westerner and becomes Presbyterian. Let's talk about the significance of Arabian and Indian Christianity. It is illustrative of the extraordinary reach of Christianity through trade networks long before missionary boards and organized global efforts. The faith travels naturally with merchants and sailors and refugees. We see Christianity in Arabia known long before the rise of Islam. In India, we see the presence of Christians long before European colonization, shows that Christianity is not a Western import, but an ancient indigenous faith in the East. We also see, and there's some evidences of its spread in farther east into what is now Malaysia and perhaps into Indonesia itself, long before Islam moved in to those areas itself. It's something the Muslims don't like to acknowledge, and they kind of suppress that. But there are places where there are Syriac Christian inscriptions in ancient ruins in cities, often some of the jungle areas of what is now Malaysia itself. Well, let's talk about Christianity on the edges of Central Asia and over towards China itself. By the fourth and fifth centuries, the faith is pushing into the vast interior lands of Central Asia, even beginning to move toward China. Now, these efforts are small and scattered in this early period, but they set the stage for remarkable expansions in later centuries. Let's talk about the Silk Road and its route. It was not a single road, okay, but it was a network of trade routes, overland trade routes, stretching from the Mediterranean across Persia and into Central Asia, and still all the way to China. You can see some of these routes here. You have caravans carrying trade goods, silk, spices, gems, precious metals. But just as importantly, they also carry ideas and religions, including Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Christianity. The Church of the East, which is centered in Persia and Edessa, becomes a main missionary force pushing along these trade routes. Their use of Syriac as kind of a trade language helps them to spread the gospel culturally in diverse regions. So you can see how long this route is, and it's just spanning basically the width of Asia itself. And so it's just one of those arteries through which the gospel is going to spread. Let's talk about Christianity in Central Asia. Um, there's archaeological evidence that reveals Christian communities as far east as Bactria, which is now modern Afghanistan, Sogdiana, which is modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and even along the Tarim Basin in western China. You have inscriptions and manuscripts and burial sites showing us that by the 5th century, Christians were living in these areas, often as traders or artisans or part of small communities along the caravan routes. These Christians were generally affiliated with the Nestorian traditions, which after the Council of Ephesus in 431 became dominant in the Persian and Eastern empires. Their presence illustrates the missionary dynamism of the Church of the East. Though often cut off from important imperial support and under pressure from Zoroastrian rulers, they nevertheless carry the faith hundreds of miles into foreign lands. Let's talk about some of the first steps towards China. The major Christian mission to China, so-called luminous religion, Jingjiao, of the 7th century, is still off in the future. The groundwork is already being laid in this early period. Traders and missionaries are reaching the western edges of China, perhaps even into the Chinese capital itself by the late 5th century. There is evidence for Christianity in this period inside China, and there's not a lot, but there are hints of it there. Some of the Chinese records speak of foreign monks arriving from the West, and later Christian writings from the Tang dynasty suggest that the faith's arrival in China had earlier, lesser known beginnings. And so these early Christian expansions show us that Christianity was never simply just moving westward into Europe. It was also pushing steadily eastward and southward long before the modern global missions movements. It was not carried by armies or emperors, but by traders and exiles and small bands of missionaries who endured long journeys in foreign cultures for the sake of Christ. Now, their numbers are small during this period. They are pioneers. They're planting seeds that would blossom later, centuries later even, as Christianity takes firm root in Central Asia and eventually into China itself. So let's talk a little bit about the distinctives of Christianity outside the Roman Empire itself. We've looked at the spread of Christianity to Persia and Armenia, Ethiopia, Arabia, India, even into the edges of Central Asia. We need to ask, what made these churches distinctive? How did Christianity outside Rome look different from Christianity within the empire? We already know there are differences between the Eastern Roman traditions and the Western Roman traditions. The Greek-speaking churches in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Latin being the common language for the West. These are languages of theology and worship and scripture we're all familiar with. But outside Rome, the gospel takes root in other tongues: Syriac in Edessa and Persia in the east, Armenian after the invention of the Armenian alphabet. Ge'ez in Ethiopia becomes the liturgical language still in use today. Persian and later Sogdian in Central Asia. So Christianity is not bound to one culture or linguistic form, and that's something that oftentimes people connote Christianity as being a Western religion. Um, but Christianity is a global religion. In Islam, you are not um, really encouraged to translate the Quran into other languages. That you need to learn to recite it in Arabic, because that's how allegedly Allah had transmitted it to Muhammad himself. However, um, that means that understanding is somewhat limited. But when the scriptures are translated into one's mother tongue, the language that you grew up with, and you think, then um, that's important, because then the truth is better able, I think, to work its way into our hearts. That's why we encourage Bible translation. The fact that we encourage the scriptures to be translated into other tongues should challenge the notion that we're trying to impose a Western culture. Um, so Christianity is not bound to just one culture or linguistic form. From the very start, it's a faith that can be translated and made at home in many languages. Uh, in the Roman Empire, the church often relied on imperial favor and protection, especially after Constantine. But by contrast, outside the empire, Christianity frequently had to organize itself independently. Now, we do see in Edessa and Armenia and Georgia, and also in Ethiopia, they become the official state religions. But in some places, did not have that favor. And so in Persia and eastward, they develop independently without state support and sometimes under state hostility to them. Um, so the church in the East develops its own hierarchy. It's separate from Roman bishops because of the political suspicion in Persia. The Armenian and Georgian churches grew in contexts where their identity is not tied to Rome, but to their own kings and peoples. And so this independence often made them more resilient, but it also left them vulnerable to isolation and schism as well. And not having the interaction with other churches and seeking to have a uniformity of doctrine, a uniformity of this is what the scripture teaches, that would be handed down from the various councils. You see individual, localized uh, beliefs that sometimes can develop into heresies itself without that interaction and check and balance from the outside as well. Christianity outside of the Roman Empire often takes on local forms of expression. Now, in the Roman Empire itself, it did to a certain degree. You had certain customs and peoples and so forth, and how things might be done, but usually there's a uniformity. The Greek liturgy, the Latin Mass, and so forth. Those were forms that did not vary much from place to place. But you see local forms of expression outside the empire. In Ethiopia, we saw the art and architecture, those rock-hewn churches, the colorful illuminated manuscripts. In Armenia and Georgia, Christian worship blends with local customs. It produces distinctive liturgical traditions. In India, the St. Thomas Christians incorporate certain cultural practices while remaining connected to the Syriac liturgy. And so these adaptations don't dilute the faith, but show its flexibility, the ability of the gospel to be at home in every culture. And unlike Rome, where Christianity eventually gains imperial protection, many of these churches lived and still live under constant suspicion of outright persecution. In Persia, Christians were accused of siding with Rome and suffering martyrdoms, especially in the 4th century. In Arabia and Central Asia, Christians were often minorities. They had to compete with Judaism and Zoroastrianism and Buddhism and later Islam. And so their survival depends not on political favor, but on deep-rooted faith, strong communities, and monastic discipline. There are some doctrinal divisions, though, that occur. The great theological councils out of the 5th century, the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, have a deep impact on these non-Roman churches. The Church of the East becomes associated with Nestorian theology. It separates it further from churches of the empire. The Coptic Church in Egypt and the Ethiopian Church both rejected Chalcedon, aligning with what is often called Miaphysite theology. And so these divisions remind us that the distance and the isolation could reinforce theological differences. Once separated from Rome and Constantinople, these churches often walked their own paths for centuries. As I mentioned before, there was not that check and balance that could occur from interactions with other wings of the church, as it were. So taken together, these features show us that Christianity outside of the Roman Empire was like linguistically diverse, it was culturally adaptive, it organized independently, and often was politically vulnerable. And yet it endures. In some cases, like Ethiopia, it endures more strongly than in regions where Christianity was once dominant under the Roman protection. And so this global and resilient Christianity gives us a fuller picture of the early church. It was not simply Mediterranean, but worldwide, already in its first centuries itself. So as we close this lecture, let's take a step back and kind of look at the larger picture itself. By the year 500, Christianity has spread far beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. It was no longer only a Mediterranean faith. It was not confined to Greek and Latin itself. In all the places where it goes, it kind of takes on its own flavor in a sense. It spoke new languages, it produced new forms of worship and art, it adapted to new political realities, sometimes embraced by kings, sometimes opposed by emperors, sometimes just ignored by rulers. And yet it was always the same gospel, the same message of Christ crucified and risen, carried faithfully by missionaries, merchants, monks, and martyrs. So this reminds us of a profound truth from its earliest centuries. Christianity was a global movement. It was not the property of one empire or one culture. The Roman Empire might have given the church roads and cities and imperial favor, but the gospel was never bound to Rome. It was always moving outward, always crossing borders, always adapting without losing its essence. And so the story of Christianity outside of Rome is a story of resilience, diversity, endurance. It prepares the way for later missionary expansions in the medieval and modern periods, but it also stands on its own as a testimony to the universal reach of Christ's kingdom. Let's talk a little bit about these things now. We'll move into kind of a Q&A session here, and let me stop the share here. Stop share. There we go. Okay. So our first question, how did churches outside the empire differ in structure, language, and experience from those inside it, meaning the Roman Empire. What were some of how did it change? What were the differences, do you think? Well, one way is languages. We see it spreading out and the liturgies being adopted in the local languages, whereas in the eastern part of the empire, it's going to be in Greek, although later on down in Egypt, you'll see Coptic or ancient Egyptian. You have in the west part of the empire, you've got problems, not problems, so you have Latin being the predominant language there itself. So language is one of the ways. What about structure? Uh, Organizationally, is it looking to the answer to the churches in Constantinople or to answer to the Bishop of Rome, as Latin Christianity would? No, it develops local leadership. Although, they might look to some of the leadership among Syriac Christians. They would look to some of the leaders there, but their organizational structure is a little bit different. Um, you might have local leadership bishops, maybe archbishops, they might go under different terms, but they don't have the same authority as, say, the Bishop of Rome would exercise over the Western Latin churches themselves. And then experience is all just local. You know, some of they may not have imperial favor. They may not have the favor of the kings. In fact, there might be outright opposition to them in some places. Yes, so you do have this is a Christian nation, and it can flourish under that. But whatever the external circumstances are, the Lord's going to grow His church. However He pleases to bring glory to His name. All right, in a decentralized structure. Yeah, local languages, distinct. Yep, that's true. That is true. Um, Now, how is independence from Rome was it an advantage or a disadvantage, do you think? Not being tied to Rome. You think it was an advantage or a disadvantage? Well, doctrinally speaking, I think it was a disadvantage because you don't have the outside check and balance. Understand some of these early churches rejected the faith. And I thought I turned the ringer off. I'll let the answering machine get that. So I think it was a disadvantage because you didn't have the outside check and balance. Now, some of these churches rejected, for instance, the Council of Chalcedon, and some rejected the Council of Ephesus. And so, from the eyes of the churches in the eastern part of the empire and also the western part of the empire, these churches that had rejected these councils were kind of outlaws in a sense. They did not embrace the faith, and so some of these views might be adjudged heretical itself. And so the question is, are they truly Christian? Typically, uh, we would associate with a biblical Christianity. Do they adhere to the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Creed of Chalcedon itself, and the seven early ecumenical councils? Um, that kind of defines Western Christianity, although we'll have Protestantism and Roman Catholicism and so forth out there. And so the attitude of the West towards some of these churches is that um, they don't adhere to the same doctrine that we do. And so their isolation led to, I think, has led to some of that, and it would be at a disadvantage itself. All right, then. Well, as we reflect on this global expansion of Christianity between AD 70 and 500, we have to remember the church did not grow because of imperial power or political support. It grew because ordinary believers carried the gospel with them, sometimes at great personal cost. And the Spirit of God worked through merchants and exiles and slaves and local rulers to plant seeds in distant lands. Um, the same God who spread his word along the roads of Rome also carried it across deserts and seas and mountains, proving that the gospel truly is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, in every land, in every tongue, in every age. Well, I know this is ending a little bit early, but this is a topic I was kind of excited about and wanted to discuss with you. God willing, next week, lecture 15 will be the church at the dawn of the early medieval period. And then the last Tuesday of this month, lecture 16, which will be the last for our uh, course, we'll have lessons from the early church for today. Um, and we'll have an examination available for you if you would like to take that exam, and we'll coordinate that with Pastor Rocky. Lord bless you, and you have a good evening.